I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 17, Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. All witnesses have completed the required tests in advance of our meeting. I'd like to remind the participants, whether it be the members or the witnesses, that they do please wait until I recognize them by name before they speak. All comments should be addressed to the chair. Members, and also we do have the list of members who'd like to ask questions. Now, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee will continue its study of the war in Ukraine. I'd like to remind members that the officials will be with us today until noon. Unfortunately, no additional witnesses could confirm their appearance for today's meeting. I'd now like to take this opportunity to welcome our distinguished witnesses. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, we have Mr. Alexandre Levesque, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Europe, Middle East, and the Arctic Branch. We have Ms. Alison Grant, the Director General of the International Security Policy and Strategic Affairs. And we also have Ms. Marie-Josée Langlois, the Director General of the Sanctions Bureau. Mr. Levesque, I understand your opening remarks are for 10 minutes. So the floor is yours, after which we will open it up to the members for questions. And please do look at me every once in a while. Once you see this, that means you should be wrapping it up within 15 seconds. So all of that having been explained, Mr. Levesque, the floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. You'll be glad to hear that I'll be well under 10 minutes for my opening remarks. Monsieur le Président, membre estimé du
Chair, esteemed members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak today on the situation in Ukraine. My remarks will focus on key diplomatic actions and measures taken by Canada in response to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine.
From the onset, and in the 950 days since the invasion, Canada has unequivocally condemned Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. We remain firmly committed to fundamental principles like Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including its territorial waters. Accordingly, Canada will continue to support Ukraine both bilaterally and through international cooperation within the G7, NATO, the OSCE, and the United Nations and any other forum where we can exercise influence. We remain steadfast in this commitment. Canada
is actively working to advance the Ukrainian government's 10-point peace formula, a plan that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, the United Nations Charter and international law. With this initiative, Ukraine has mobilized the support of the international community, including emerging economies and developing countries. All of this to frame an eventual peace settlement on its terms. Canada's commitment to this initiative took the form of its co-chairmanship with Ukraine and Norway of Working Group 4 of the Peace Formula, which focused on the return of prisoners of war, illegally detained civilians, and deported children. At the Ukraine Peace Summit in Bürgenstock, Switzerland, on June 15th and 16th of last, the Prime Minister chaired a discussion session on this human dimension of war and announced that Canada would host a ministerial conference on this theme that will take place at the end of this month.
The International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children, which now includes 40 member states, launched in Kyiv on February 2nd of this year during Minister Joly's most recent visit to Ukraine. The coalition coordinates efforts and cooperation between Ukraine and partner states to address the illegal deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children by the Russian Federation. The issue of Ukrainian children who have been illegally deported, forcibly transferred, or displaced in other ways is complex and requires greater global attention. Experts agree that thousands of children have been deported to Russia or transferred to temporarily occupied territories. Le Canada et l'Ukraine entretiennent plusieurs accords bilatéraux.
Canada and Ukraine have a number of important bilateral agreements reflecting growing cooperation, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. For example, Canada has signed a landmark bilateral agreement on security cooperation with Ukraine to establish a strategic security partnership. This agreement builds on the G7 joint statement of support for Ukraine and outlines Canada's key long-term security commitments to continue to support Ukraine in the defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity, the protection of its population, and the pursuit of Euro-Atlantic integration. As another example, the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement signed in 2017, the modernized version of which was signed in 2023 and came into force on July 1st this year, aims to boost economic exchange between the two countries by covering sectors such as agriculture, industrial production and services, while focusing on long-term economic development and Ukraine's post-war construction.
In total, Canada has committed over $19.5 billion in financial, military, humanitarian, development, security, stabilization, and immigration assistance in response to Russia's full-scale invasion of on February 24, 2022. Canada's response also includes sanctions. Since 2014, Canada has imposed sanctions on more than 3,000 individuals and entities in Russia and Belarus, as well as in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and Moldova, for their complicity in violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of these countries, as well as for gross and systematic human rights abuses. C'est avant tout à l'Ukraine de choisir.
Above all, it is up to Ukraine to choose how it defends itself and its people. Canada supports increased cooperation between NATO and Ukraine, including through the NATO-Ukraine Commission and enhanced NATO assistance measures. We will continue to advocate for Ukraine's membership in the alliance as soon as conditions permit.
Canada supports the stability, security, and sovereignty of Ukraine as it resists Russia's war of aggression. We are committed to contributing to Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levesque. We will now open it to questions from the members. For the first round, each member will have 5 minutes, and we start off with Mr. Hoback. Mr. Hoback, the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here this morning. We've seen a lot of commitments from this government as far as financial commitments to Ukraine. I'm just going to drive down and see exactly how much has that been actually delivered. I'll start off with the $5 billion for the G7 Extraordinary Revenue Accelerating Loans. Can you tell me how much of that $5 billion has actually now hit the ground and where that money kind of roughly went as far as sectors it went to?
Thank you for the question. I believe all of it has been dispersed, and I would have to double check. So if I can come back to you.
First two, and what was used for?
So
How it's been
typically,
dispersed and the amount that's been dispersed? If you could
so
give us
that I can answer, because this goes towards the support of Ukraine's basically balance sheet. So through a various number of organizations like the IMF, like the World Bank, we support the daily operations of the Ukrainian government, and that's what that money is dedicated to.
No, so if you can get us that, would be great. We announced $15 million for support of vulnerable children, youth at risk, improve access to justice, increase family and civil society awareness for missing persons, supports male survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Can you give us a breakdown of percentages of how much of that $15 million is going to each of those categories, or is the majority going into one category versus the other?
I'll have the breakdown.
Can you get us that breakdown then, please?
Of course, sir.
Okay. We committed $20 million to their electricity grid and their infrastructure. How much has that hit the ground, and where has that gone to?
That is going essentially to multilateral fund. So basically, we pool these resources. The EU in particular has set up a large fund, and for maximum efficiency, what we do is contribute to that fund so that it can be dispersed directly into the energy infrastructure relief structure.
How do you find accountability in that massive fund then? If it's a big fund, how does Canada make sure that the 20 million actually hits the ground? And again, has that 20 million actually flowed out of the Canadian coffers into the fund?
On that last question, again, where the money stands in the cycle, I'm going to have to come back and provide the answer in writing. In terms of accountability, look, the first thing we do is work with very trusted partners. We have mechanisms, first of all, control mechanisms in our financial sector or financial.
Overseeing their part of the fund?
Well, you mean on the ground?
Yeah, no, as far as you've got this fund created, like you said, a bigger fund, is there a Canadian part of the decision-making process of how the money is being spent?
It depends on each fund. We do have, for example, for the Ukraine donor platform, we have a Canadian dedicated and seconded to the Secretariat, so we have direct eyes on this. A lot of the clearance, the control measures happen in Ottawa before the money even gets dispersed. And then, of course, like I said, when you deal with the IMF, when the World Bank, with the European Union, you're dealing with trusted interlocutors, trusted partners that have also their own internal control mechanisms in place.
Again, we look at 15.4 million for IMF, Ukraine's capacity to safety clear territorial mines, Ukraine's government technical assistance, Government Canada expert in justice and energy sectors. To me, it sounds similar to what we just committed the other 15 million for, and what you described as regards to the funds going to the IMF or bigger organizations or trusted partners. So, are these Zane dollars? Are these new dollars? And again, how do we know, for example, mine clearing? How do we know that the funds actually went to that commitment?
I can assure you there's no double counting there. So, I mean, there's been multiple rounds, multiple decisions to constantly come up with new ways, new monies to support Ukraine in various ways. So these announcements are made cumulatively, they're not. It's not the same amounts that have been re-announced. And again, where it stands exactly in the disbursement, we can come back to you in writing.
It's kind of deceiving to say the Canadian government's committed this money to Ukraine. Actually, we committed it to a fund that's helping Ukraine. So Canada by itself is not administering any of these funds. It's just giving to a bigger fund made up of other countries and then contributing. Is that fair to say?
Actually, the vast majority of the support to Ukraine has been in macroeconomic support. It is administered by large trusted organizations like the IMF, to actually lower the cost of administration, but that money, they're basically the ones then ensuring the controls on how the Ukrainian government spends it. But the money, it's not like there's a percentage that comes off the top. The money goes directly to help the Ukrainian government.
And the perception is that it's going directly to Ukraine. The perception given by the Prime Minister of Canadians is that this money is actually going directly to Ukraine, but in reality, it's something totally different. It's going to an EU bureaucracy that's administering the fund. Is that fair to say?
I would have to disagree with this statement, Mr. Chair. It does go to the Ukraine. It is administered for the sake of efficiency and ensuring transparency and accountability through other international organizations.
Yeah, but you have no accountability or assurances of those organizations, you've told me. Like you don't have any oversight.
Time is over.
Why do we have 5?
Because
First round, 7 minutes.
Because I've done the math and they have informed me that they were only here till noon.
So if we would have started at 11 o'clock, would we all got 7 minutes?
Potentially, yes. So we next go to MP Zuberi. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to witnesses for being here for this important update around Ukraine and the war of aggression. I want to ask a handful of questions around the sanctions and other items, but my first question is around sanctions. And you mentioned in your opening statement that we have leveled 3,900 sanctions on individuals and entities. And of those 3,900 sanctions, Mr. Chair, there's a lot of conversation going on at our side. Thank you. Of those 3,900 sanctions, How do those align with our international partners and the impacts that alignment has, those sanctions have, I should say, due to alignment? Can you talk a bit about that?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would say there's a high percentage of alignment between the entities, the individuals in the entities that Canada has sanctioned and that some of our largest partners, mainly the United States, European Union, and the UK have sanctioned. This is not by accident, it is by design. Of course, we have different mechanisms for doing our own assessment and finding the open source information we need to justify the sanctioning of individuals. But we do coordinate and we do exchange information to reinforce the lists. Because the whole point of sanctions is to tighten the net, is to prevent openings in any given jurisdiction for individuals to be able to funnel funds and do business with citizens of that country or that region. As far as the impact this has, I think it has maximal impact when we have as much coordination and announcement of sanctions entities as close as possible to the same time. For the reason I just stated, if an individual, Russian oligarch, for example, is sanctioned in Canada but not in the US and not in the UK, that creates an opening to funnel funds and therefore to continue what we consider to be feeding the war machine. So importance of coordination and tightening the net is top of mind when we identify potential targets.
Thank you. And you mentioned also in your opening statement the International Coalition for Return of Ukrainian Children, how Canada co-chairs this with 40 other countries. Can you speak about the impacts on children and what is happening? There has been some media attention on this, but what has been happening to these children? What age ranges are we talking about that have been brought into Russia and are held currently in occupied territories in Ukraine?
It is precisely because of the precarity of these children's situation that Canada has attempted to broaden the coalition so that it is not a political issue ever, but something that should appeal to a majority of countries. So the role that Canada plays in this is mostly to shed some light, is to flash a spotlight at the issue so it is not a forgotten one. And that's why we're very pleased with the growing. It started with about a dozen or 14 countries, and through a lot of diplomatic work, we've expanded it to now 40 co-members. The way it works, the work of the coalition is mainly one of advocacy, of again, shedding some light on the situation, but is not one of directly getting involved with the return of children. For that, we work discreetly because these things have to be discreet if they are to be successful with a number of partners, some international organizations like UNICEF, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, but also a couple of states. You will have heard that the state of Qatar has played a discreet role. It has the ability and the trust of both Ukraine and Russia, and it has been able to negotiate some discreet and quiet deals between the two countries. The Vatican has been involved with this as well. So the role here is to empower these players to make an effective difference. To your question on the age of children, it has been the full span, from very young, like 4 or 5 year olds, to 18-year-olds, and they have ended up in across Russia and across occupied territories.
I'm afraid you only have 3 seconds remaining.
I give it to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Zuberi. We next go to Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Bergeron, since you're joining us virtually today, and I was advised by the clerk she didn't have a chance to do a sound check, if you could say a few words.
Alors, merci infiniment, Monsieur le Président. J'espère que le son est convenable pour nos services de...
Thank you, Chair. I hope the sound is okay for our interpretation services. You want me to keep talking? No, that's fine. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the officials of Global Affairs. It's always appreciated. Listen, the subject is so broad that we would have liked to keep you for 2 hours with the committee, but unfortunately, you're only available for 1 hour. So we will try to do the most we can in what little time. Canada is the first G7 country to adopt legislative provisions allowing for seizure or freezing of assets, of sanctioned assets and sanctioned individuals and organizations. The nations aim to eventually use these funds to be returned to Ukraine for its reconstruction. In the last G7 meeting in Italy, Canada suggested $5 billion that would be contributed from frozen Russian assets. Now the question is, as we speak now, how much of those frozen assets will be able to be transferred to Ukraine or have already been transferred to Ukraine for its reconstruction? Chair, thank you for the question. I think there are two aspects that it is important to emphasize here, and perhaps there may be a twofold aspect of the question. The legislation that was passed to modernize our legislation on sanctions aimed indeed for the possibility of seizing assets under the sanctions system and according to the legal process connected with it, and eventually with the possibility of monetizing those assets and then returning the benefits to the victims of the conflict in Ukraine. The 5 billion that you refer to is part of a different system. It's an agreement that the G7 countries have in order to have a leverage effect on the bank accounts and reserves belonging to the Russian government within our respective countries in the G7 countries and indeed in the European countries. So it's not so much that the money is seized and directly returned to the victims of the conflict in Ukraine. It's that out of that money, we use it collectively with a guarantee that that money will continue to be frozen for a long period so as to be able to provide a loan using that as the principal for the capital. And we're reimbursing Canada's 5 billion. I would have to check with my finance colleagues and get back to you in writing to find out if that's okay. And as regards the transfer of the frozen assets to Ukraine, do we have some idea of the amounts already transferred so far and of the amounts that we plan to transfer in the near future? I'll ask my colleague Marie-Josée Langlois to give you more details on that. Thank you very much for the question. In this case, once again, perhaps a bit more explanation. The sanctions law allows us to freeze assets belonging to listed persons or associated with measures taken by the government in the sector. The legislative amendments that set up the seizure and confiscation system concerns the assets of persons directly listed, not necessarily the frozen assets. There's a different process. Once a listed person's assets are frozen, then by means of an order in council, seize those assets by the government, a legal process that goes through several stages, including a lot of procedural equity for people that may have ownership interests in those assets. So the people can ask for an administrative review of the order in council. And after that, once the government moves forward with it, they will bring forward a request to the provincial court where the seized assets are located in order to obtain confiscation of the assets for the government. And once the goods are assigned to the government by the court, then they may be distributed according to the clauses in the act that you mentioned regarding the victims and reconstruction of the countries in order to restore peace and security. So it is a process that goes through several steps. And as you know, there are two assets that were seized in December 2022, money belonging to Mr. Abramovich, as well as an airplane last year located in Toronto. and the process is continuing in those cases. So I understand that we still have not transferred anything to Ukraine so far.
We next go to MP McPherson. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the officials who are here today to share the information with us. You know, I represent a riding in Edmonton, in Alberta. We have an enormous diaspora of Ukrainian individuals in our community, and they are deeply worried that the world's focus has shifted away from Ukraine. It's very important to hear the work that is being done with regards to helping Ukraine rebuild, support for Ukrainian children being returned to Ukraine. I want to get a bit of a sense from you on the geopolitical impacts, though. You know, we are seeing Iran even today threatening further violence in the Middle East. We also know that Iran is working closely with Russia. We know Russia and China have an agreement to work with each other. Could you give us a sense of what that looks like and what the threats are there, how you see that playing out over the next few months?
It's not pretty. What you've described is the moment we have been predicting and analyzing for some time of the so-called polycrisis, where multiple events, wars, instability, challenge to international law is happening simultaneously, and it's extraordinarily complicated to navigate. You speak about the fact that the attention of the world has shifted, and I can attest to that being the case, certainly by way of mainstream media. I spent quite a bit of time over the last week with a number of colleagues and with ministers at the United Nations General Assembly, high-level week. I can confirm that conflict in the Middle East is much more present on everybody's lips. Having said this, as a department that looks at the entire world, I can say in all humility that we can think and chew gum at the same time. And our attention is not divided. It is equally on both conflicts and more, but also in the pursuit of Canada's interest in all of this. So we are able to focus on the events in the Middle East and provide policy advice and financial support. But like I said, to date, the support of the Government of Canada is nearing $20 billion to Ukraine. And that's not just stuff that happened 2 years ago. It's been wave after wave after wave. So, but we have to have this ability and to call out the abuses whenever we see them.
Thank you. Well, and you speak about the United Nations General Assembly. We all know that Russia was chairing the Security Council at the time that they invaded Ukraine. Obviously, this is a challenge. We'd like to see Canada play an important role in the reform of the United Nations, because I think there needs to be much more done there. You also spoke about the Fair Trade Agreement and rebuilding Ukraine. When I was in Ukraine a year ago, that was one of the key priorities for the Zelensky administration. They were very clear that they needed support in rebuilding now so that people could return back to civilian areas that had been destroyed by the Russian Federation. One of the things that they had asked for is that Canada help underwrite the rebuilding processes and help with the demining processes. So I'd like your insight onto how that is going and how we are supporting Ukraine in that way.
For the question, Mr. Chair, you've identified a couple of the top priorities that the government of Ukraine requests that are immediate and urgent. Some of them remain in the military domain. Even at a ministerial conference a week ago in New York among G7++ countries and Ukraine, the topic was energy. And the number one thing that Ukraine was requesting was not generators, was not rebuilding the grid, was air defense. Because obviously, if you help prevent attacks on the electric grid, you don't have to repair it as much after. So a number of countries that have the equipment are able to support this. A lot of what we have provided, and there has been money, and I don't have the exact details of the amounts and which organizations it has gone to, but I know that some of it has already been flowing, has been to mining action, to demining, particularly in the areas where rebuilding the electric grid is absolutely required. And then other than that, the biggest request for support has been in macroeconomic support, which I've addressed earlier. The government of Ukraine, because it is spending so much on reconstruction already and on waging its war, requires the government to keep to keeping its basic functions. And last, and I'll just finish on this, Mr. Chair, it's inviting the private sector to invest. Last assessment last March, the assessment of the damage and the reconstruction needs was already at $486 billion, and that was 6 months ago. No government in the world can fund this kind of reconstruction. It's going to have to come through investment by the private sector.
Thank you. We now proceed to the second round, and we start off with Mr. Majumdar. You have 4 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. It's an honor to be in the committee. 4 minutes doesn't give me a lot of time, so I'll start with some domestic questions. What actions has the government taken to assert Canada's jurisdiction over Russian state assets in Canadian correspondent banks and investments via instruments like Eurostar, Euroclear, or other partnerships?
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for the question, Chair. So in Canada, as you know, a number of the entities of the Russian governments are listed on our sanctions list, as is its central bank. So those assets are frozen in Canada because they are on the sanctions list. And Canada is working with G7 colleagues in terms of how to leverage those frozen assets to mention as the...
Forgive me, just in the interest of time.
Sure.
May I ask you to table to the committee what actions the government has taken to assert Canadian jurisdiction over Russian assets, including through Euroclear, including the breakdown and total value of those assets? That's a source of information which I think colleagues around the table would benefit from understanding. To what degree has Canada actually established jurisdiction over assets and Canadian currency through Euroclear and others? In the next few minutes, I was hoping to take a step back and look at the geopolitical consequences of the region. To what extent has Ukraine impacted the Russian Navy in the Black Sea?
I'm sorry, could you repeat? To what extent the conflict in Ukraine has?
To what degree has Ukraine impacted the Russian naval presence in the Black Sea?
Thank you for the question. I think we've all seen through the course of the war that Ukraine has successfully been able to launch maritime attacks against Russian assets. They've certainly taken a number of vessels out in the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and what we have seen is a restationing of many of the Russian vessels outside of the area of Crimea, further to the east. So the Ukraine has definitely had an effect, I would say, on the Russian Black Sea Fleet and the ability for Russia to launch attacks from that theater.
Thank you. And then subsequently, Vladimir Putin had sent his foreign minister to Beirut to negotiate with the Lebanese as recently as in the last 24 hours. To what degree do Russia and Hezbollah cooperate in the Mediterranean Sea?
I cannot say that we have any information or have seen any evidence of cooperation, certainly not security-wise or military, in the Mediterranean Sea between Russia and terrorist groups.
Clarify the Mediterranean theater, so
Yeah.
Lebanon and Syria.
I see. You can. Yeah.
As Alexandre has mentioned, Hezbollah and Russia, direct connection. I can't speak to this, but of course we have been tracking very closely the Iranian supply of ballistic missiles, drones earlier to Russia, and that's of deep concern to us, and we have taken several actions against that move by Iran.
So Iran, which backs Hamas and Hezbollah, cooperates with Russia in the Mediterranean theater as much as Russia collaborates with Iranian equipment in the Ukrainian theater. These geographies are only separated by about an hour or two. They're not far from each other. If I could, in the last minute, Allison, ask you for your perspective on do our allied interests understand the common threat that the collaboration between Russia and Iran poses, not just only to Ukraine, but to stability in the wider Middle East region.
Very, very briefly, because we're out of time.
In Brussels, our allies do speak about this. We receive briefings on it. There are regular discussions at the North Atlantic Council level about the threat, the larger threat that Russia poses in the Euro-Atlantic region, but also outside of it, because of course threats know no borders, and that's well understood in Brussels. So these are being discussed, the issues.
We next go to MP Oliphant. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you to all of you for your work you do every day, and also for reminding the committee that you can do 2 things at once, if not 22 things at once. It's appreciated. The world is a messy place, and that I know that Ukraine and the people of Ukraine remain very much on the top of your mind. As I look at the desire we all have for peace as an overarching thing, Canada has supported Ukraine with reform efforts. Right after Crimea, there was significant training of military staff, as well as ongoing support to continue democracy. Military support since Russia's illegal invasion, which has been profound, as well as macroeconomic support, sovereign loans, et cetera, for the maintenance of government as usual. So we'll continue to do that, and I think it's important to just continue to assert that. Some of that is done through partners, and some of it's done directly, such as sovereign loans, et cetera. When we look at peace, could you opine on what peace would look like for Russia and what peace would look like for Ukraine from what they have told us?
Thank you for the question. It is a rather large one and fundamental, but perhaps I can start with what Canada sees as the just path to peace. This war was an unprovoked war, a war that violated what every country through international law and the UN Charter recognized as legitimate borders of Ukraine. So any just peace is one that must go through the reestablishment of territorial integrity on Ukraine's fundamental, on Ukraine's terms, the withdrawal of Russian troops, and ultimately reparation. We haven't spoken today too much about reparation. We've talked about the cost that collectively we are trying to impose on Russia for its aggression, but the level of destruction, not to speak about the opportunity cost of the development Ukraine would have pursued had it not been for this horrendous war, is also part of the equation. And Canada is member of and is contributing to a number of fora where calculating the reparation, calculating the damage that is imposed on Ukraine will all be part of what we see as a just end to this war. Ultimately, it is up to Ukraine to determine on what terms it is prepared to accept an end to this war. And the commitment that this government has made is to support Ukraine as long as possible so that it attains this level of satisfaction with the terms of finishing the war. As for Russia, it clearly wants to steal territory. It wants to continue occupying parts of Ukraine and consider it sovereign Russian territory. And we don't have an active dialogue with Russia, as you know, with extremely limited diplomatic bilateral and multilateral contact. But to the best of our assessment, what we can assess is that Russia will want to retain some of the territory it invaded before calling this a win from their point of view.
That's it?
6 seconds remaining. Thank you. We now go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 2 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'aurais voulu
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to talk about other delays regarding the armament supply to Ukraine, but I have little time. So I'm going to talk about something else. Around September, Mongolia became the first country who signed the Rome Treaty, who received Putin, even if he has an international arrest mandate. So what was the reaction of Canada, and what message does Canada has given to its Mongolia's partner, because they did not conform to their obligations under the Rome Treaty? Thank you for the question. First of all, I just want to repeat here the very firm commitment of Canada to the International Court of Justice and international law. So when there is a international warrant, arrest warrant, we expect our partners to obey the international court orders. So you can imagine that behind the doors, the messages that were transferred before and after are those the ones who, maybe encourage Mongolia to conform itself to the orders of the court. But of course, each state decides to do what they want to do. They make their own decisions. It seems that we have the policy of our geography, and of course, we agree with the situation of Mongolia. I mean, geographically speaking, where they are in the world probably contributed to their decision, but we are certainly expecting countries like Canada to remind to all the members of that signed the treaty that they have obligation under those international treaties.
Go to Madam McPherson. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again to the witnesses. And I'm going to follow up on some of the questions that Mr. Bergeron was just asking with regards to the international criminal justice and international criminal court systems. My understanding is that Canada has contributed to the ICC and ICJ for the prosecution of those responsible for the theft of children, that is a predominant case that we are supporting. Can you explain to me how the funding to the ICC and the ICJ works? And are those funds directed specifically to that, or is it directed towards the support of the international justice system writ large?
Thank you for the questions. I'd say a little bit of both. But for example, in the case of the ICC, Canada did provide $2 million in funding to support a trust fund to increase the court's capacity to investigate, in particular, sexual and gender-based crimes and crimes against children. So we've both
in Ukraine or anywhere in the world.
In Ukraine. And it's for this particular investigation. So the money, if I understand correctly, and I'm not a legal expert, these are run as bespoke investigations, and countries that are parties to the Rome Convention can provide any dedicated support by providing expertise, so investigators or legal experts or funds. And I believe that in the case of Canada, it's both funding and some bespoke expertise, so by way of legal experts.
Well, and of course, from our perspective, from the New Democratic perspective, we should be supporting the international justice system, and we should be listening to the ICC and the ICJ in all circumstances, not picking and choosing when we apply and when we do not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now go to Mr. MP Abel-Taif. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I do also have a very large and important Ukrainian community. The Ukrainian cause is always on our minds, all of us in Canada, and of course, in specific, myself. The relationship between Iran and Russia is known, and it strengthened with the signing of the INSTC, which is International North-South Trade Corridor between the two countries, something that Russia has waited for about 94 years to get through. That is a strategic trade line and access for Russia toward warm waters and to get to international markets through Iran. In return, Iran has been supplying ballistic missiles and drones to Russia. How significant those supplies has been into the result of the war and to how the war has advanced so far?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. It's I can't provide a direct equation or an expression of X number of pieces of equipment, whether it's missiles or drones or otherwise, having contributed directly to this. You will, but we know it has those transactions have taken place. You will have seen to that effect a couple of weeks ago, G7 members calling this out. This was on the basis of, at that point, what we collectively considered to be solid enough intelligence that suggested an alignment and a support that was material. And so this is now a new reality that we're conscious of and that we must call out, denounce, and act on. And as you know, Canada is one of the countries in the world that has been most forward-leaning in condemning, in sanctioning, and in even calling parts of the Iranian government, the IRGC in particularly, a terrorist entity. So what I can predict is further pressures, further measures in the future, especially by way of sanctions, when we are able to identify with higher levels of certainty which parties in Iran are culpable of having facilitated this sort of commercial arrangement and strategic partnership between the two.
Is there any indication that these sanctions and the listing of IRGC, the sanctions against Russia and the listing of IRGC as a terrorist organizations, do you have any indication that this has been already working to impact somehow this two countries coalition basically against Ukraine in the course of this war? And how do you believe that Canada has played that role to minimize the effect on the war and on the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian territory?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the existential question when it comes to sanctions effectiveness, and I've actually testified before this committee before on that very subject. I would say sanctions, of course, can work in the short term, but the vast majority of the time they work in two ways. They work long term, and they work when they're done in collaboration with as many countries as possible. A single country implementing sanctions against an entity or individuals will likely not have a huge impact. What it has had for the case of Canada versus Iran is, first of all, virtually eliminating all possibilities of large numbers of the Iranian leadership apparatus having any ability to do business, to transfer funds, to have any economic dealings, any financial dealings with Canadian entities. But it has also set a bar. It has sent a message to the world. And in that sense, there's an element of leadership and inspiration for other countries that look at it, and a bit of a snowball effect that may encourage others to follow our suit.
Does Canada believe that thank you very much. Thank you.
So now we go to MP Alghabri. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Levesque, if you allow me, I'll take advantage of your presence here and ask you to update this committee on Canada's effort in the evacuations in Lebanon for Canadian citizens in Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously not a topic I had prepared for today, and my colleagues who are in charge of consular affairs and emergency preparedness are more up to speed on the details. What I can say is that all contingencies are in place. You will have seen over the past couple of days repeated messages to all Canadians living in Lebanon to expedite their exit. Of course, this is something the government has been saying for 11 months, but we are seeing some uptake on some of the commercially augmented availability of flights. There's been good uptake on this, and this is a situation that we are watching very, very closely on an hour-by-hour basis. Of what I can say is contingencies are in place, and we are prepared to offer support where and when possible. But the key message remains that the situation in Lebanon is extraordinarily volatile right now, not just because of the exchange of fire that can happen through missiles, drones, and otherwise, but because of a certain level of lawlessness and fighting in between different factions, particularly over the past few days. I can also add that we have this thing called the ROCA list. It's the registered registration of Canadians abroad list. Communication for all Canadians, for example, who live in Lebanon and are registered with this, get frequent updates by SMS on the status of things. And that communication is almost on a daily basis these days.
So, Mr. Chair, I think this is an important moment to remind any Canadians who are still in Lebanon to first register with the mission there, with the Canadian Embassy, so they can receive updates. And if they need help, they certainly need to reach out to Consular Affairs and to heed the government's call in finding a way to leave as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So it now being exactly 12 o'clock.
It's 11:56.
Oh, clock there. Okay, my apologies. I was off by a couple of minutes. I do apologize. But I'd be remiss, first of all, thank you very much. That concludes our second round of questions. But given that we had scheduled it for 2 hours, I'd be remiss if I did not ask our witnesses if they could possibly stay with us a bit longer for a third round of questioning.
It's unfortunately I am chairing a meeting in less than an hour back in my department. Had we known, we might have been able to extend a little bit, but we were scheduled to come for 1 hour. So with apologies, we will need to take our leave.
So on that note, allow me to thank you, Mr. Levesque, thank you, Ms. Grant, and thank you, Ms. Langlois. Very, very grateful for your appearance. So do we want to? You good with that?
Yeah, do it.
Okay, the meeting stands adjourned.